she kept his legacy alive. And so people remember King, but they remember him because of her.
Remembering Coretta Scott King, her life and tireless work for racial equality alongside her husband, Martin Luther King Jr. Plus, a look at the clinic in Mexico where Mrs. Scott King went for treatment before she died, and the San Diego mortuary where her body was taken late this afternoon.
You're connected to San Diego's local news leader. This is 10 News Live at 5.
Coretta Scott King died overnight at a holistic health center in Rosarito, Mexico. The body was then moved to San Diego. 10 News reporter Salvador Rivera is live in Webster with more on Mrs. King's final days.
Well, Mrs. King's body was brought here briefly around 2 o'clock to the Anderson Raxdale mortuary in Webster. Her family had taken her to a holistic center in Rosarito, Mexico for one last-ditch effort to save her life.
Very good, very good. Yeah.
Martha Martin says Hospital Santa Monica saved her husband's life 10 years ago. It's located right next to the water in Rosarito, about 20 miles south of San Diego. The facility treats terminally ill patients with a holistic approach. Coretta Scott King came here in search of a miracle while suffering from ovarian cancer.
She was faced with an illness that had serious consequences, and her physicians in the United States felt that there wasn't much they could do.
Dr. Kurt Donsbach runs the hospital. He said King checked in Thursday night. She was admitted under the name of Ruth Green. By Friday, everyone knew who she was.
She came down for observation and evaluation, and before any treatment was actually able to begin, she passed away.
Mrs. King died late Monday night, early Tuesday morning. Her body was taken from the hospital to a funeral home in Tijuana. Family members were with her every step of the way.
We made all the arrangements with U.S. border officials to expedite the crossing in the most dignified but quick way possible.
David Stewart is the U.S. Consul General in Baja California. His office handled Mrs. King's return to the U.S. After some paperwork in Tijuana, the body was driven across the border and taken northbound on the 805. It arrived at Anderson Raxdale Mortuary.
The family does not desire any contact outside of family members right now.
After a brief stay, Mrs. King's family accompanied her body on its way home to Atlanta. Mrs. King's body was brought here to prepare it for air travel. It was taken to Riverside. From there, it was flown to Atlanta, Georgia. We're live in Webster. Salvador Rivera, 10 News.
All right, Sal, thank you for that.
From San Diego's #1 source for local news, this is News 8 at 5.
At this time, in memoriam to the death this morning of Coretta Scott King, I would ask all members to stand and observe a motion of silence.
The nation pauses to remember Coretta Scott King. The wife of slain civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. died last night at a holistic health care center south of the border. Her death is our top story tonight on News 8 at 5. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Barbara Lee Edwards.
And I'm Stan Miller. Coretta Scott King's death comes 5 months after she suffered a stroke and a heart attack. She was 78 years old.
Mrs. King died while receiving medical treatment at Hospital Santa Monica, a holistic health care center in Rosarito Beach. Today, her body traveled along the King Freeway as she was transported from Mexico to a mortuary in Choice Creek. Mrs. King's death comes just 17 days after her last public appearance at a Salute to Greatness dinner in honor of Martin Luther King Day. News 8 Steve Price is live in Choice Creek tonight with more on how Mrs. King is being remembered. Steve?
Barbara Lee and Stan, Coretta Scott King died in her sleep. Her daughter Beatrice is the one who found her this morning. She made the discovery while she was trying to wake her up. King was in Mexico at the time of her death. She was there hoping for a miracle.
She came with another name to the hospital.
What was the other name?
Ruth Green.
Ruth Green was really Coretta Scott King, widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And when she arrived at this holistic hospital in Rosarito Beach Thursday night, she wasn't doing well.
She had so many complications that we were actually just dealing with complications at the moment. There was no chemo because there was no treatment yet. given because it was not possible yet.
Doctors here say King had ovarian cancer, heart problems, and half her body was paralyzed from an earlier stroke. In fact, they say doctors in the United States had given up hope.
Her physicians in the United States felt that there wasn't much they could do, and the family chose to look for another option. Alternative medicine was something they chose.
It's not surprising that King tried to fight her failing health all the way to the end. She has never been one to give up. Without question, she was one of the most influential civil rights leaders of our time. After her husband's assassination in 1968, she worked tirelessly to keep his dream of equality for all people alive.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
The loss of Mrs. King is a loss to our entire country.
The consulate's office said very little about King's death. Her family members said even less. King's body was quickly brought back into the United States and returned back to the Atlanta area. Her preliminary cause of death is sudden respiratory failure. And today, President Bush remembering Miss King as a remarkable and courageous woman. Coretta Scott King died today at the age of 78.
Steve, there's been some controversy over this place that she was getting the holistic treatment in Mexico. Anything new on that?
You know, Stan, doctors say they didn't even get a chance to treat her. They were still trying to diagnose exactly what was wrong with her. They had just gotten a bunch of her medical records from the U.S., so they say they hadn't even started treatment on her at the time of her death.
Okay,
all right,
thank
Steve,
you.
thanks for that report.
Now, NBC 739 News at 11.
Paying tribute to a fearless leader. A civil rights icon passes away at a clinic in Baja. Tonight, Coretta Scott King is remembered by the San Diegans who knew her well.
And this was a courageous, great lady.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Susan Taylor.
And I'm Marty Levine. The wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, died this morning at a clinic in Rosarito Beach. Tony Shin is at the San Diego mortuary where authorities brought her remains.
Marty, her body was brought here, but it was only here for a very short time. It was then quickly transported to a mortuary in Riverside County.
I'm going to keep on marching for justice, equality, peace, and reconciliation of the human family until I am called home.
And now Coretta Scott King is going home for the last time. The wife of slain civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died early Tuesday morning at this holistic healing center in Rosarito, Mexico. That's where she was to begin treatment for several health problems, including ovarian cancer.
She had a stroke 3 months ago. Okay, she came with a half body paralyzed, so she was in really bad condition.
King's body was transported across the border to this San Diego mortuary, whose founder, H.W. Ragsdale, was a longtime friend of the King family.
Look right in here, there's a guy with a hat on.
That's you right there.
That's me.
With the hat. Former San Diego City Councilman George Stevens marched with the King family during the height of the civil rights movement. He says not only did Coretta Scott King fight for equality, she also supported her husband and raised 4 children.
And this was a courageous, great lady who was on the road. She was in the movement before her husband was killed.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight.
After Dr. King's death, Stevens says Coretta became a fearless leader in her own right, earning her place in history.
Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, they were black women who led, dangerous movements. And she will be remembered in the category of those black women and other women who led courageous movements and marches.
Now tomorrow, Mrs. King's body will be taken to a private airport somewhere in San Bernardino County. She will then be flown home to Atlanta, where she will be buried by her husband. She was 78 years old. Reporting live in Webster, I'm Tony Shin. Marty and Susan, back to you.
Thank you, Tony. The Rosarito Clinic where Mrs. King went for treatment has a controversial history. It's called the Santa Monica Hospital, a self-described holistic healing center. The hospital's director is Kurt W. Donsbach. Court records show Donsbach pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison for tax evasion and smuggling unproven drugs into the U.S. No one is accusing Donsbach of any wrongdoing in Mrs. King's death. He spoke publicly today from Mexico, saying King's family came to him for treatment.
Her physicians in the United States felt that there wasn't much they could do, and the family chose to look for another option. Alternative medicine was something they chose.
Don Spack is not a medical doctor, and therefore information on his practice is not listed on the American Medical Association's website. Meantime, doctors in Rosarito say Coretta Scott King died of sudden cardiac respiratory failure, but she had been battling ovarian cancer.